Have you ever wondered why some people make a ton of money while working as little as possible, while others work non-stop and yet live paycheck to paycheck? Most people have little to no idea how money works. The fact that we use money on a daily basis gives us the illusion that we know how to handle money and how money works. But the reality is that most people simply know one way to make money, and that is to get a job. But quite often, they're really bad at spending that money. On the other hand, some people make it to the top without ever having a 9-to-5 job. So what differentiates one group from another? The simple answer is that the second group simply understands how money works. Let me ask you a very simple question. Will you be able to win at any game if you don't know the rules of the game? Absolutely not. And even if you know the rules, it's not enough to just know the rules. The ones who master the rules of the game are the ones who are more likely to win that game. The exact same thing is happening with money. If you don't know the rules of the game, you will certainly fail. So the people who make a lot of money, the people who made it to the top, are the ones who have mastered the rules of the game, mastered the rules of money. So here in this video, we'll take a look at 5 rules of money that help the rich people to get to the top and stay at the top. So if you're ready, give this video a thumbs up, and let's start with the first one. Avoid banks at all costs. How much do you think interest you will earn if you deposit your money in a bank? Let's assume for a moment that you worked super hard and you saved $10,000. Or how about $100,000? So you're thinking how to invest that $100,000. And one of the options that you're looking at is a fixed deposit in a bank. Now, for your investment to make any sense, then you have to get at least 3-4% on your investment. Because if you don't get 3 or 4%, then inflation will eat it away. As of the time of this video, inflation is something around 3-4%. I mean, usually it's around 2%, but because we had high inflation for the last few years, as of 2024, it's around 3-4%. So if you don't get at least 4% on your $100,000, then the actual money, the purchasing power of your $100,000 is going to decrease every single year. Yes, it's still $100,000, but next year, you will be able to buy fewer things with that $100,000. So how much interest do you think banks are paying you? Now, it's supposed to be at least 4%, right? However, if you right now go and check how much the top banks in the United States are paying for fixed deposits, you will be absolutely blown away. Because banks such as JP Morgan, Chase, Citibank don't pay more than 0.01%. I don't care how much money you're investing. I don't care how much money you're planning to keep in a fixed deposit. If you're making less than 1%, especially if it's 0.01%, then your money isn't growing at all. But that wasn't the case all the time. Because if you just go back a few decades ago, you will find out that most of the banks used to pay a pretty decent rate on their fixed deposits. And it makes sense for them to pay that much money. I mean, think about how bank works. Let's say, for example, that I have $100,000 sitting in my home. So if I take that $100,000 and go to the bank and deposit it in a fixed deposit, for example, the bank is going to provide me, let's say, with 5% interest. And then the bank will take that money, turn around, and lend that money to you in a form of a car loan, for example, and charge you a 10% interest. So that difference between 5 and 10% is the profit that the banks are making. So it's in the best interest of any bank to provide you with a decent rate of return for you to be motivated to keep your money in their bank. Because the more money the bank is going to attract, the more money they will be able to lend, and the more money the bank is going to make. So are there banks today that can get you 5 or 6% at least? Absolutely. There are banks in the United States and even across the globe that provide you with 6 or 7% interest rate on your fixed deposit. But these are small regional banks. These banks have no power to compete with banks like JP Morgan or Chase. And as we have seen with the case of Silicon Valley Bank, all of these banks are at risk of bankruptcy. And when the Silicon Valley Bank failed, the experts made a study and found out that more than 200 banks across the United States are at the risk of defaulting. So eventually, we have 2 choices. Either we're going to take our money and keep it in a huge stable bank such as JP Morgan, and that bank is not going to pay us anything at all. I mean, that interest they pay you, 0.01%, is nothing. Or you can take your $100,000 and deposit it in a small regional bank, but there is a risk that bank could be defaulted. Yes, one morning you could wake up and you will watch the news and you will see that the bank where keeping your money have declared bankruptcy, which is why rich people never view banks as the place to keep their money to grow. A bank is a place to park your money while you're looking for an opportunity to invest your money wisely and safely. You know that your investments are going to get you at least 8 to 10%. And you know for a fact that your money won't be evaporated the next morning just because the bank has declared bankruptcy. Number 2, every bank has the right to print money. If I would tell you that every bank in the United States or pretty much across the globe has the right to create money, you will not believe me because that sounds illegal. The only bank that has the right to print money is the Federal Reserve. Why? Because the Fed is part of the government. Yes, of course, you can argue with me that, no, the Fed is independent. Of course, it is independent to a certain extent, but it's fully run by the government and it's controlled by the government. The chairman of the Fed is appointed by the President of the United States. So it's semi-independent, but at the end of the day, it serves the interest of the state. So it makes sense that the Federal Reserve can create money because it's the source of the dollar. But it does not make sense that every commercial bank in the country could just randomly print money. I know that it sounds absurd, but that's exactly how the banking system today works. If every bank has the right to create money, then the best way to become a millionaire, the best way to make money would be just open a bank and start printing money, start creating money. You won't just be a millionaire or a billionaire. You can literally just turn yourself into a trillionaire and you'll be the richest person on the planet. I know that sounds illegal, but that's how every bank in the United States works, or pretty much across the globe. Let me give you an example to illustrate to you how every single bank out there is creating money. Let's say, for example, that I have saved $10,000 and I want to keep it in a bank. Let's call it Bank A. So I would take my $10,000 and deposit it in the Bank A. What do you think Bank A is going to do with that money? Will it just keep it in their reserves? Absolutely not. Because every bank in the US has the right to lend 90% of that money to someone else and can keep just 10% of that money in that bank. Which means that $9,000 out of that $10,000 will be lent to someone else. Let's call that someone else John. So John comes to the bank and he borrows $9,000 out of the $10,000 that you have deposited in that bank. Let's assume for a moment that next week I will just go to the bank and withdraw my $10,000 because I just need it for something. So I have withdrawn my $10,000. But John is still walking away with that $9,000, which means that the total money in circulation right now isn't $10,000. My $10,000 magically turned into $19,000. And let's assume for a moment that John is going to take that $9,000 and he will go to a second bank. Let's call that second bank Bank B, and will deposit that $9,000 in Bank B. What do you think Bank B is going to do? Exactly. Bank B will do the exact same thing as the first bank did. It will take 90% out of that $9,000, which is $8,100, and will loan it to someone else. Let's call that someone else Jack. So Jack walks away with $8,100. And let's assume for a moment that in a few days, John is going to go to the bank and he will withdraw his $9,000. Now, what happened here? John has withdrawn his $9,000, but Jack is still walking away with $8,100. And the exact same thing repeats over and over and over. So it's estimated that every $1,000 that you deposit in a bank, every $1,000 that you go to the bank and you deposit in the bank will eventually turn to at least $10,000, if not more than that. That's why if you just zoom out for a moment, you will find out that most of the money in the economy doesn't exist at all. It's not cash. It was not printed by the Fed. It was created by all of these commercial banks. That money does not exist. It's just there in the computers. These are just digits in the computers that these banks have created, but that money does not exist at all. And that's how every single bank in the country or across the globe keeps creating money. And that system is known as fractional reserve banking. That was something really difficult to do in the past because we did not have computers back then. So the banks kept a significant portion of depositors' money in the bank. Besides that, most of these banks kept a pretty good portion of gold in their bank to guarantee to the people who keep their money in that bank that they are safe. But that's no longer the case today. Banks are not required any of those requirements anymore. So rich people understand that the money that we have today is not real. It does not exist. It could be created by any commercial bank, which is why wealth isn't really money. The real wealth are the assets that constantly create cash flow. Number 3, you can make money by borrowing money. Most people borrow money because they cannot afford something, such as a car, so they have a car loan or a credit card loan. I mean, especially when we talk about houses. Houses today are so expensive that the vast majority of the population cannot afford them. So it's absolutely normal for you to get a mortgage, borrow money from the bank, and buy that house instead of just paying rent for your entire life. Because if you get a mortgage, at the end of the day, at the end of the journey, when you paid your 15-year or 20-year-old mortgage, you'll be left with a house. And that's how most people in the United States build wealth, not just in the US, but pretty much across the globe. I mean, mortgages have revolutionized the global financial system and allowed people to be homeowners. But that quickly turned people into debt slaves. Because besides just getting a mortgage, people went on and started getting a car loan in order to be able to afford the car that they drive. Then they got hooked on credit cards, which means that at the end of each month, all they do is that they work super hard in order to be able to afford the minimum payment on all of their loans. And a lot of people even graduates from schools by having a student loan debt. So what's the purpose of your life? Why on earth are you working so hard? Because you have a student loan debt, you have a car loan, you have a mortgage, you have a credit card loan, and maybe some type of other loans that you might probably have. And that's why a lot of people think that debt is evil. That's why we have all of these phrases such as debt is the root of all evils, never get into debt. And that makes perfect sense because people have been trapped into this never-ending debt cycle. However, that's not how rich people think. Rich people do not borrow money because they cannot afford something. Rich people view debt as a tool in order to make more money. Let's assume for a moment that a rich person wants to start a business. Do you think that he's going to use his money to start that business? Absolutely not. Because he knows that he can use debt to build that business. And when that business starts making money, then he will just use his money to expand that business probably. And even then, he does not have to use his own money. Let's say, for example, that this rich person wants to sell pens. Let's say it's a traditional business. So besides just setting up the business in the US and setting up a shop, he has to set up his supplier. Because China has turned itself into this global factory of the world, let's assume that this rich person is going to fly to China and will find a pen factory from where he's going to buy all of these pens. Now, a poor person thinks that this rich person should go and buy as many pens as he can and then just ship them to the United States. But that's not what a rich person does. He will go to the factory and he will borrow these pens. Yes, of course, if there is no trust between these two people, because these people don't know each other at all, he cannot borrow a lot of these pens. And to make his first shipment, he probably has to make a small down payment of 15 to 20%. So the factory that is producing pens 24/7 non-stop for years, they will gladly loan him as many pens as he wants. So to start with, they will loan him 1 container of these pens. So that rich person will take that container, ship it to the United States, sell it. When there will be revenue in the business, then he will pay the factory. So the second time when he comes back to that factory to borrow more pens, that factory will gladly loan him 2 or 3 containers. And that's how a rich person builds a business, by using debt. And there are many advantages for using debt to start a business. Because what if the business goes wrong? What if something goes wrong and you won't be able to sell those pens? You haven't tied up your cash, so you're still liquid. You still have money to pay for your expenses. So whenever that business starts working again, whenever that business starts generating revenue, then you will pay your supplier. And that's how rich people often do business. This is just one out of many examples of how rich people use debt in order to make money. Even if you look at the stock market, the richest people, Wall Street, often uses debt in order to make money in the stock market. You see, people like you and me who are trying to make money in the stock market by predicting which stocks are going to rise, the real wolves of Wall Street usually make money by predicting which stocks are going to fall. I know that it sounds a bit controversial, but let me explain to you. Let's say, for example, that this hedge fund that's run by billionaires assumes or expects that Tesla stock is going to fall by 20% in the next 3 months. Let's assume for a moment that the price of a Tesla stock right now is $500 and that hedge fund expects it to fall down to $400. That hedge fund is going to go to a broker and borrow that Tesla stock and will instantly sell it in the open market for $500. So the hedge fund has $500 in the pocket. Now, 3 months from now, when the Tesla stock drops to $400, that hedge fund is going to use $400 out of that $500 to buy that Tesla stock again from the open market and give it back to the broker, pocketing the difference, which is $100 in this case. So the hedge fund basically made $100 on this deal without using its money at all. And that's what shorting a stock is. That is a very popular strategy on Wall Street. But it's often done by the top professional investors because it's a very risky strategy. Number 4, it's cheaper to be rich than to be poor. Poor people, or the people who are struggling financially, are always looking for ways to save money. If you're living paycheck to paycheck, then that's the only way to live your life because you cannot afford anything above that. But if you just pay a close attention, you will realize that life gets cheaper as you get richer. I know that it sounds controversial. Let me explain. Let's say, for example, that you want to buy a house. Houses are extremely expensive. Like the vast majority of people cannot afford a $500,000 house. It will take a lifetime for you to save that much money. And if you're renting your entire life, then owning a house for you is not an option at all. Buying a house, for example, is one of the best financial decisions you will ever make, especially if you live in one area for a really long time. Because a house, regardless of what happens, has real physical value. So no matter how high inflation is, your house will at least grow slightly higher than inflation. But if you're poor, it's extremely difficult for you to buy a house. First of all, it's not just because house prices are so expensive. Even the people who are making 6 figures most likely won't be able to buy a house. They will have to work for a few years or probably a decade to save that much money. And that's why we have something called a mortgage, where you can go to the bank and borrow that money and buy the house. So instead of paying rent, you will be paying your mortgage, which makes perfect sense. But if you're poor, you will not be able to get a mortgage because it's much riskier for banks to loan you money. If you're living paycheck to paycheck, if you're barely making ends meet, then the bank is worried that if they will give you that mortgage, you won't be able to make your mortgage payments at the end of one of the months and you will have to default on your loan. And that's why it makes it extremely difficult, extremely riskier to loan you that money. And even if you qualify for a mortgage, for example, your mortgage rate is going to be higher. You see, when you're investing in any type of investment, this is the logic. This is how it works. The bigger the risk, the higher is the reward. The lower the risk, the lower is the reward. So if you're a poor person, if you barely make ends meet, if you're living paycheck to paycheck, so chances that you will default on that loan is extremely high, which makes it much riskier to loan you money. Compare that to a rich person borrowing money from the bank to buy a house. Chances that rich person is going to default on his loan is much lower because that rich person probably has like a business, stocks, bonds. So if he loses one of his sources of income, he still have his stocks, for example, that he can sell in the open market and make his mortgage payments. So chances that this rich person is going to default on his loan are much, much lower than a poor person, which is why banks are more comfortable to loan them money. And that's why their rate is often much lower than the rate that a poor person will get. And when you're getting a mortgage, even a difference of 1% in your mortgage rate is going to make a substantial difference. It could be a difference between paying a few extra $100 every single month, or probably a few $1,000s every single month. So the richer you are, the less you will be paying in your mortgage rate. So although that a poor person needs that mortgage much more than a rich person, you have to understand that banks are not charity organizations. Banks are not there to help people. Banks are not there to improve people's life. Banks are there to make money like any other business that's out there, just like Apple, just like Amazon, just like any other company that you can think of. Number 5, credit cards are banks' favorite tool. There is a lot of advice on the internet on why you should start using a credit card. It doesn't make sense for you to use a debit card when you have a credit card. Because every time you use a credit card and you pay for something, you get your credit card rewards. And then you can use these rewards in order to fly for free, or you can get huge discounts at expensive restaurants, or you can stay in hotels for free. There is a long list of benefits, and every single bank provides you with different kind of benefits. And I understand why it makes sense to use a credit card. I mean, why wouldn't you get so many benefits in the first place? But stop for a moment and ask yourself this very simple and very basic question. Why are these banks are trying so hard to get you to start using their credit card? I mean, why are they doing all of these deals with all of these hotels and restaurants in order to provide you with all of these benefits? There should be something between the lines that most people aren't really paying attention to. You see, every bank provides you with loans in different ways. You have, for example, mortgages, which are 15 to 30-year-old loans. And these are the kind of loans that have a very low interest rate. And then you have a car loan, which is much shorter period. It's around 5 years, for example. And your car loan has a higher interest than your mortgage loan. And then you have, for example, credit card loans. Now, credit card loans have a much higher interest rate. When your mortgage rate, for example, is around 3, 4, or maybe even 7%, your credit card loan has an interest rate of at least 25%, and in some cases, 30%. So the shorter the period of the loan, the higher is going to be the interest on that loan. And that's why the banks want you to start using their credit card, because they cannot charge you that kind of interest rate on any other loan other than credit card. Of course, if you pay your credit card balance at the end of each month, you won't be paying any interest at all. But if you just paid attention, life is very unpredictable. Today you have money, today everything is perfect, you're making money, the paycheck is coming every single month. But what happens if you have an emergency? What happens if you lose that job? What happens if you cannot work? That's when you start using your credit card and you will start missing your credit card payments. Now, when you miss one payment, it's not a big deal. You might actually pay it off and continue living. But what happens often is that people start getting used to missing their credit card payments. And that's why if you take a look at the numbers, you'll find out that total credit card debt in the United States is over $1 trillion. It's something like $1.2 trillion, because banks successfully could lure people into using their credit cards, and now they can charge them a 30% interest on that loan. The entire point of a bank is to get you to a position where you will borrow as much money as possible. So we live in this society today where people get a mortgage, so then they have a car loan because they gotta drive a car to get to their places, to get to their work, and then they graduate from colleges by having a student debt, and then people have their credit card debts. So if you just pay attention, their life is about making their minimum loan payments every single month. So they will work super hard in order not to lose that job. What happens if they lose their jobs? Everything will collapse. They will file for bankruptcy because they cannot afford to keep making their payments, because everything they have is financed by a bank. And that's the position that every single bank in the country or the world wants to get you to. So, should I stop using credit cards? Absolutely not. Because in this modern age of capitalism, stop using credit cards is not an option, because you need a credit score. Now, your credit score is going to be that decisive factor upon which will people do business with you or not? Will you be able to get a mortgage or not? What is going to be the interest rate on your mortgage? So you want to keep using credit cards. But here is an interesting and a smart way to use your credit card and a safe way. Now, instead of using your credit cards to pay for everything, get a credit card, ideally just one, and make sure that you pay one subscription or two subscriptions from that credit card. If you are using Amazon Prime, for example, and you're paying for your subscription, then make sure that you pay that subscription using your credit card. And then set your debit card on auto payment that at the end of each month, it automatically closes that balance. But at the same time, you're building your credit score to a certain extent. And when you use your money to pay stuff, it's psychologically different because you feel how your money is decreasing. So you're more careful with your spending. Now compare that when you use a credit card. You're thinking, don't worry about it. Just buy it, just pay for it, and then you will close that credit card debt sometime later. And then when that sometime later will come and you won't be able to make that payment, you will have to pay a 30% interest on that credit card debt. These are just some of the rules that rich people use to get to the top. And these are some of the rules that most rich people abide with in order to stay at the top. Of course, there are many more rules of money that we haven't discussed in this video, but there are multiple videos on the channel that will help you to get started, because the rules that will help you to get to the top are often very different from the rules that you need to stay at the top. So check out the channel. There are multiple videos on the rules of money. There are multiple videos on how to start investing. There are multiple videos on how to start your financial independence journey. But for now, if you have enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up. Thanks guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one.